Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Just giving everyone a few more minutes to join, and we'll get started. Happy Thursday. Hello, hello. Nice to see everyone. All right, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and a warm welcome to the SDGs in Action Forum here at Fairleigh Dickinson University. I am Maricela Rivera, the Assistant Director of Global Engagement, and I'm honored to be your host for this event. I would like to express our gratitude to each and every one of you for joining us here today. Your presence highlights the importance of our collective commitment to addressing the world's most pressing challenges. Today, our focus is on SDG number 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities. We are fortunate to have with us two exceptional individuals who will enrich our discussion. Our guest speaker, Ireola, is a multidisciplinary agent of transformation whose story is marked by bravery, wisdom, and a passion for education, culture, arts, and justice. Ireola provides executive-level consulting in the field of education, organization development, operational management, cultural and folkloric arts, and leadership development. She is a principal steward and director at JE, LLC, an agency providing strategic direction to creative and executive seeking transformational impact. Born in the Arta Bonita region of Haiti, Ireola is the daughter of Marcita de Juste and the late Jean Roberts Villas. She is a sister to those meaning well, a nurturer to youth seeking guidance, and an organization doula to mission-driven work. Our student moderator today is Mr. Shytail Clay. He is a senior here at FDU who will be graduating in the fall. He is majoring in government and law with a specialization in legal studies and a minor in political communication. Shytail is one of the most involved students at FDU, having served in various leadership positions on campus, including Vice President of Financial Affairs for Student Government Association, Vice President of Academic Affairs for Student Government, and Student Body President for the Florham campus. He is also actively involved in the Diversity and Inclusion Commitment for Becton College and the university's commitment of diversity and inclusion, amongst other roles. Shytail is a strong advocate for students and is passionate about serving and helping his fellow students. Thank you once again for joining us as this SDG in Action Forum. Let's make this an engaging and enlightening afternoon of discussion and collaboration as we all collectively strive for a better, more sustainable future. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our distinguished guests, Ireola Olaifa and Mr. Shytail Clay. Please, Shytail, take the floor.
Thank you so much for that amazing introduction, and I'm so happy to be here with all of you to have this amazing and important conversation. First I want to say, while we're having this conversation, please feel free to use the chat. If you have comments, questions, concerns, please feel free to use the chat bar. We're more than happy. I'll be looking at it, so if you have any questions, I'll make sure I'll go through it. And also, turn on your cameras if you want. I don't like looking at these blank boxes throughout our presentation or anything like that, so please feel free to engage with us. And with that, we'll get started. So, we've heard about your very, very, very impressive biography and what you do in your community. So let's take a deeper role and deeper dive into your vision and your purpose. As a rising leader in a global sector, share with us why you are so passionate about the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, and which goals would you consider more closely in line with your work?
Thank you, Shytail. First, I want to start off by greeting everyone. Hujambo, bonsoir, good evening. It is evening where I am in the world. Good afternoon to you all. I also would like to acknowledge Monica Yin and Maricela Rivera, who have been incredible in really bringing this experience full circle after just one meeting. And now I get to, sit with you all to just have a great conversation around community and these SDG goals and what they really mean and how they can really ground and anchor some of the work that we are all doing, both as students and as professionals. So again, thank you, Shytail. You're also a very impressive young man, and I truly wish you the best in all of your endeavors. So to kick off with this beautiful question, I would say that number one, it's always important to have goals. As an individual, as a community, as a collective, it's important to have goals. And so knowing that we have issues that need to be addressed throughout the world and throughout these various communities, I do believe that sustainable goals really just looks at what can we address now? What can all of us be doing? What actions can we be taking as just human beings, whether you're professional, whether you're a student, what can you contribute to, as a constructive member of your society to further develop humanity? And so I would say for me, my favorite goal will have to be education. And the reason for that is there's a Khan proverb that says, those who don't know can know from learning, right? And as simple as that may sound, I find it to be profound because education is really at the root of every single sector, I feel, of the sustainable goals. So in order for us to build sustainable communities, we have to know how. We need the know-how. We have to know how to build better. We need to understand the various materials that align with Earth, that actually align with the geographical locations that we choose to build homes. And so we can't really have community development without first understanding what those definitions are, what our resources are. And for me, the basis of all of those things goes back to education. There's a reason why you're all here spending dollars or using scholarship monies to get an education, to further your career, to further your life, to further develop yourself as an individual by seeking higher education. And so I don't think that I need to preach to you all the importance of education and how fundamental it truly is to the transformation of thought, to the transformation of mentality, because in the current space that you are as a learner and eventually as a professional, you are getting to influence other people through the things that you've learned in your experience as a person, whether it has been experiences that you've had, through clubs, in the home, or professionally, everything that you've learned, you then get to share, which means that you then get to be a part of that cycle of education, that cycle of learning for others. And so learning is not this, education doesn't always have to be represented in this formal sense. I think that the moment you hear that, you hear institutions, you hear school, you hear class, you hear books, but really education is this dialogue that we're having here. There's going to be information that I'm going to be able to share with you, that Shytail will be able to share with you, that we have not heard before. And so that also gets to be a part of that learning experience. And I think that that's why for me as an educator, so I am very biased also, as an educator, it truly is for me one of the highest priorities of all the goals for me.
And thank you so much for that. And I do want to have a follow-up question with that one, but also wanted to add, like with education, like people like to think that education's only in the classroom. And as you said, classroom settings or universities or schools, but I also like to think of education also as exposure. You're as exposing 100%. Yourself to different things in other ways, then you can learn from those. I feel like that's another way to also think of education. And thank you so much for that. Well answered. But to follow up with that, you're talking a little bit about it already, I think, just a tiny bit. But could you expand on how you personally got involved with application and the sustainable development goals and just, trying to improve them in your own way?
So my journey with education started quite young. In high school, I used to work as an after-school counselor. And so they had a CIT program that sort of, helped us develop the skills that was required so that by the time we were juniors in high school, we could become counselors. And then by senior year, and then of course, after graduation, it was something that you could continue the path. And for me, getting to teach like 5-year-olds and 7-year-olds how to read, how to reinforce their reading comprehension, and just seeing how sponge-esque human beings are when they're younger, and how impressionable human beings are, and how we essentially could be taught to do anything, like anything, literally. Whether it's a somersault or whether it's to recite, a piano piece, you can literally teach the human being anything, because learning is actually a default mechanism that all human beings have. You're going to learn by default. And so the kind of learning that you're doing that's what we call education. And so at that point, I worked in the school that I was working at was in a neighborhood, as they call it, like low income, low socioeconomic status. And so the learners there also have this like thirst for information, because you recognize that when they go home, a lot of them were just watching television. There wasn't much engagement, and it wasn't necessarily that the parents didn't want to engage with these learners. It was simply the fact that the parents were really busy. Sometimes they were coming to pick the children up and then going to a secondary job. And so when the children were in school, they really just wanted to make the most of that experience. And I think that the joy of education really came through the joy that my learners had learning from me. So, I guess that's a bit oxymoronic, but it really was that, seeing how I can actually teach a human being how to achieve something that they didn't have before, really sort of, it did something to my soul. And I think at that point, I recognized that education was probably something that I was going to be doing for a very long time. And as I grew in that journey, obviously, after I graduated, I went off to college, so I wasn't a counselor anymore. But even in college, as I was, getting involved in student affairs, and various clubs, et cetera, it always came back to education. So I studied at the University of Miami. Go Canes. Love, yes. So it came back sort of 360, because as I was gearing up to be a part of this Haitian Students Association, I was born in Haiti, so I'm Haitian. And so there was, for those of you who may not know, Florida and South Florida, and more specifically, has a huge population of Haitians. There was a first wave of Haitians that came in the 60s. Those were the more affluent Haitians that were sort of leaving because of the dictatorship for Papa Doc, who was a dictator at the time, and a lot of the elite at the time felt oppressed, and so they left. So they went to New York, they went to various parts of the United States, and that was the first exodus. That was like the first wave of Haitians really leaving the island. And then the second wave was in the late 70s, early 80s. And that's a phenomenon that a lot of people call to as the boat people, like the migration of people literally getting on boats, traveling to Miami. And obviously, because Florida is in closer proximity, a lot of them did end up in the Miami, Fort Lauderdale area. And so because of that migration, similar to how a lot of Cubans ended up in South Florida, there's a huge population of Haitians in Miami and in South Florida in general. And so while I was at the University of Miami, I became the president of the Haitian Student Association. And here I was again, having to teach the students on campus about my culture, and doing so in a very rudimentary way. Because obviously, the University of Miami is a private school. And so a lot of the students are coming from different parts of the United States. And honestly, some of them were interfacing with islanders for the first time. You know what I mean? Because a lot of the students had done high school, middle school, elementary school, all in the private sector, and so their exposure was very limited, right? And so here I was again getting to teach people about the foods that we eat and why we eat them, and the different cultural values that we have and why we have them, because there was a lot of stigma. There was a lot of stigma around Haitians. There was a lot of trauma that Haitians had gone through in South Florida because of the ignorance and the stigma that and propaganda, quite frankly, that was used against us. And so re-engaging the community of students on my campus as a junior and senior in high school meant a lot to me. Like I took that role very seriously because I was like, as we were talking about earlier, education in the university setting especially is not only in the classroom. If anything, it's actually, I would say only half of that experience is in the classroom and the other half is through the engagement. And that's why your advisors and your educators encourage you to get involved in student life, encourage you to get involved in local community surrounding your university, because that truly is what the human experience is about. Life is it's not a bubble, right? Life is expansive. And so we went out into the community. We were working at a high school, a Miami Senior High School, which was predominantly Haitian, because some of the learners there even still struggled with identity issues. Some of them didn't want to be known as Haitian because of the stigma, right? Haitians were known, and I'll share some of these things with you. There was stigmas like, oh, you guys were boat people. That means you're extremely poor. You people eat cat. You people do voodoo. You people carry AIDS. I mean, think about that. Growing up as a child and you being identified, your humanity being identified as those things. Think about the shame that comes with. Right. And so you had students that were being jumped on their way to school or from school. It was horrible. Thank goodness for me, I grew up on the tail end of that. And I'm going to tell you my age, but I grew up on the tail end of that. And so by the time I was in high school, some of that had already subsided and there was beginning to be some reconciliation, and people were now sort of coming out and saying, no, like, we're so much more. Like, did you know that Haitians actually were the first free republic nation in the Western Hemisphere, because Ethiopia was never colonized, right? And so now people are learning these things. They're learning how the Haitian flag contributed to the flag of countries like Colombia and Venezuela, because people were inspired that this nation rose up and fought against both France and the Spanish and won. And so then it's like you had a sense of pride that now came about, because we're like, oh, we're not just like people who just came off of a boat, and we're not just these folks that are seen as the scum of an entire community, of an entire South Florida community, and probably other places in the Northeast, such as New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, because a lot of Haitians were also going there as well. So all that was sort of part of, I would say, my experience in really falling in love with just education and the power that it really has to be able to influence someone.
Thank you. And from hearing what you're saying, like, I was like, yes, you preach it to the choir, because like it's so important, like especially within the university level, when you get to college, creating those clubs and organizations, and then exposing your fellow students to things they may not even know about. Wait, are you still here? Fair warning, guys. Her Wi-Fi is being a little bit wonky, so if it freezes, she will come back. She will be back. I'm just gonna wait for her, like a head nod or anything like that. Oh, there she is. Okay, we're good. We're good. All right. Okay, good. We're good. So now, well, back to what I was saying, I think that's so important for that exposure and to having those conversations with your friends around you, especially within university level. And what she was talking about in Florida, it's so important, because what you were saying in Florida that was happening with Haitians, you said you don't want to tell your age or nothing like that. I'm not going to ask the question, but I will say, for me at least, whenever I did go to school, I went to school in Ohio and I went to school in West Virginia, and a lot of those kind of like, I think for me being a Black man, I were getting those same things, not as the more cultural, but more as like, oh, you're Black, go back to the boat, go back to Africa, like all of those disgusting kind of comments that you hear. And that it comes back to exposure. The more and then the population kind of changed, there's more Black people around you, your mindset changes, because you're having people saying, hey, no, we're not like that. Or we have political figures like a Barack Obama that comes in and say, hey, we have education too. All right, so now I'm going to segue into our next question. So at any point in your career, have you ever felt as though being a woman, or a Black woman especially, leader, restricted you from key resources or networks or global opportunities needed to fulfill your goals and your dreams?
So to answer that question, I'm going to say yes and no. And I'll start off with the no. The no is because, you know, I want to say that I grew up in a household where my humanity was always seen. You know, I was privileged to grow up in a home with a mother and a father. And even though, you know, my mother still speaks very little English to today, what she did instill in me is my personhood. Like the idea that as a human being, I have a right to be here in all spaces, and that I belong, you know, that I genuinely belong. And so when you have parents, or in community, right? Not just parents, but community of people that instill those values in you, you sort of move through the world in a different way, because of your mentality. You know, you sort of automatically, you don't automatically think that you're going to be recused or kept away from an opportunity because you're being taught at home, like, oh, well, you belong, right? You belong in all these different spaces. So it does come as a shock when you can vividly see, you know, a level of discrimination happening, or that there was some sort of bias that did, in fact, keep you out of an opportunity or keep you away from something. So my first encounter with injustice was in middle school. And so at this point, I'm in the States so middle school, about 12 years old. I'm in the States for about 5 years. And within those 5 years, again, you know, anytime you move to a different environment, you're sort of just kind of like taking things in. You don't necessarily have an opinion. So by the time I was like maybe 9, 10, I didn't really have an opinion about more so like biased opinions around human beings. Because in elementary school, you're not really thinking about stuff like that. You know what I mean? You're thinking about, you know, your snacks, the fun things that you get to do. But when I was in middle school, we ended up moving to a different town. And I was zoned for the school that was like really, really far away, because they were planning to build another middle school. But in the meantime, a lot of us in my neighborhood had to be like bused to the school very, very far away. And within that school, it was in the western part, so more so like countryside of Florida. So, and I know a lot of times people think that Florida is only like Miami and Las Olas and those kind of places, but Florida is country, okay? There's a lot of like open space, open area. You can drive for miles and just like not see anything but trees. And so at the school, I started noticing that my professors and even the administration was, you know, treated people of my skin tone very vividly differently, to the point where like I will never forget that I had a science teacher that had like these stickers on her board that talked about like, you know, like rap music not being music, and just like very derogatory. What I learned later on in life was like very derogatory statements, right? And so eventually, you know, you know, after about like 3 months, you're at the school and you recognize that no, this school is actually quite racist. Like I'm not the only one seeing what I'm witnessing. You know, a lot of the students recognize what's happening, and still to this day, that school has a very particular reputation for being a very racist school, and very openly discriminating against its students. And using punitive measures against the students. And so this is a true story that I'm going to tell you guys. I was on my way to school, uniform on, school badge, you know, like literally everything, backpack on, and I missed the school bus. But at the time, middle school started at 9 a.m. But obviously, because we're taking the bus to a school that's far away, bus time is at like 7:15. Latest, I think, was like 7:30. So I missed the bus and I'm walking on my way. I'm walking back home because my sister was still home and she has a car. I'm walking to ask her to give me a ride. And I get to the edge of my curve, to my street, and a patrol police stopped me and asked me where I was going. I said, I missed my bus over here and I'm going back home because my sister told me she can take me to school. He says, no, I need to call your school and I need to figure out what kind of action I need to take with you. And I found that to be very strange. So I'm like, it's still 7:30. That means like school's not even in yet. Like I still have plenty of time to get to school. But obviously I'm 12 years old. This is my first encounter with such an experience. And I'm just like, okay, I'm taught to respect my elders. I'm taught to like, obey authority in that way. So I'm like, okay, great. He's going to call the school. No big deal. So he calls the school and he's on the phone and then, he like hangs up and then he's like, okay, you're going to have to come with me. And I'm still very confused. I'm like, but my sister is right there. Like my home is right there. I can show you. You can actually escort me home and then my sister can take me to school or like you can have a conversation with her. And he just put me in the car. And at that point, I'm in tears because I'm like, I don't know what's going on. And so we're driving. I don't even know where we're going at this point. And so the drive was about an hour long. Okay. And so we ended up at this truancy detention center. And so I'm there and I'm like, so I'm looking at these like, so I'm looking at bars and I'm looking at the space and I'm like, okay, so what's happening? I think it was at that point that I'm trying to understand what's really happening here. And so they obviously at that point tell me to call home. And so I call home and I'm crying and I'm telling my sister, I'm not sure what's happening, but all I know is that I'm really far away from school. Can you just come pick me up? And so she comes and picks me up. And at that time, like I said, we were only in the States for about 5 years. And I think that my sister also being young herself, didn't really understand what was going on, nor did she really ask me, what happened, because I think she sort of like took the word of whoever was sort of briefing her there. But like I said, guys, I have my backpack on, I have my school badge on, my shirt's tucked in, like I'm in uniform. And so, the situation was just very, very, just thinking back to the memory, just very weird and awkward. And I always come back to the story because it was truly my first encounter with injustice. And so at that point, I started recognizing, I'm like, oh, wait, so no, like everyone doesn't get treated the same, right? And I don't think, I was seeing my womanhood at that point, but I was definitely seeing my melanin at that point. I had a reality check, okay, at that point. And I ended up switching out of the school at the close of that year. But, that experience, helped me to really understand that the realities of our world is that we aren't treated the same. And as a female, you're also not treated the same because biologically you're different, hormonally you're different. And so the world doesn't see you the same. So then my next inquiry was like, sort of why, asking myself like, but why are we treated the same? And in certain instances, is it good to be treated the same or is it good to be treated different? And I think that as a woman now, I recognize where as a woman, I appreciate some of the treatment that I get that's different. And I don't appreciate some of the other treatment that I get because I'm a woman or because I'm a melanated woman. But going back to the reason why I said no, I still, though, continue to move through spaces as if those things do define me. That is my identity. I am a woman and I am melanated and I am from IET. And so if we're gonna treat me particularly different or keep me from particular resources, I need to understand why. And I think at this point, because I have the language and because I have the understanding, that I can question those things a lot better. But I'm very happy that the grounding that I had as a human was that I belonged.
Thank you so much for that. And it touched home for me because a lot of things that you're saying, I was like, I've gone to it. I've had that experience. I see it. I see myself in that, especially with me being a Black man here at Fairleigh Dickinson University. Like sometimes in those conversations, I feel like I'm the only person of color in those conversations or the only person of color in the room. And sometimes I got asked this question once by a parent during open house, which was, can you tell me about your Black experience on campus? Now, I could have just been completely honest and not honest, like completely honest, or be truthful. And I was truthful about my own truth. And I told her straight up, I was like, listen, sometimes you may feel alone, but let's keep it real. Me, I'm not the normal person because I use my color and I use that's my power. I'm not going to let color of my skin deter me or stop any opportunities from coming my way. And guess what? Even if it's not up to me for those opportunities to stop, and someone stops it for me, I'm gonna find a new one. I'm gonna find a new door.
100%.
That door is gonna open no matter what. And I'm so happy to hear your story and what you've been going through, because truthfully, see where you are now. That's such a powerful story, and it's so relevant, and people really need to hear it. Um, so now to transition a little bit more, we're doing a lot of transitions. But I heard that you have a presentation to share with us and the students. So at this time, I would love to hear what you have to say. I'd love to see the presentation and share it with the students.
100%. Thank you. Thank you, Shytail. So, in light of the conversations that we're having, I think that it's very relevant that, we have a conversation around community and what that means, and how that's fostered and how we build it. Because I think a lot of times we think that community is an automatic thing, and that we don't have to be active participants in it. But the reality is, even though community is a default state of human beings being together, it is something that one must continue to build and foster. And I think, everyone on this call, is different in some way, right? And so I always find it sort of silly when we get into spaces and that the only thing that we recognize is like the surface level aspect of this human experience. Because the more and more you and I will talk, or the more and more Maricela and I will have conversations, we'll recognize that we're going through a lot of the same experiences, right? Maricela and I are both women. And so, we may have experiences with children or with, various things that call to our attention as females in our societies. And so there's always going to be these points of centering, is what I like to call it. In Creole, we say potomitan, which is like the center pillar, right? And so I would love for everyone in this space right now to imagine an invisible potomitan, an invisible pillar that sits in the center of everyone on this call. And that potomitan represents understanding. It represents active listening. So not listening to necessarily respond to anything, or not listening with this idea of, oh, you already know what I'm going to say, or you're presuming what I mean, but more so a listening to understand. A listening that brings up questions in your mind, like, oh, I wonder what she means by that. Because I think that sometimes we're made to feel silly for thinking that, for not understanding things right off the bat. Sometimes we're made silly to think that we shouldn't be asking questions, but I actually think that that's silly. I think that if we're having a conversation very authentically around a topic or a subject that any one of us may not be familiar with, I think it's silly not to ask questions. I think it's silly not to be inquisitive. I think it's silly not to ever be in a state of confusion, because remember, anytime you're being brought with new information, there's going to be a level of cognitive dissonance, because it's information that your mind has to now create. For my neuroscience students, new neurotransmitters, right? New neural connections. So much is happening in your brain at that point that, yes, it's going to put your brain in either a state of shock, because you just heard something that was kind of jarring, or like just sort of like eerie, and or put your brain in a temporary state of confusion. Now, it's only temporary if you decide to inquire and seek understanding. But the moment you sort of just take that as face value without questioning, that state of confusion and that state of shock stays in your mind. And so you're perpetually confused around the so-called Black experience or the so-called whatever experience. I choose not to use color codes to name human beings, because I think personally it's very ignorant. It was a system that was created, sometime back in Italy, and I don't call myself a Black woman, because that of humans I find to be very degrading, to reduce human beings to just a shade of color, especially because I come from, my lineage comes from a continent of people that are all colors, right? From albino to, as they say, blue black, okay? So allow me to expose you to new terminology, allow me to expose you to new concepts and frameworks as we review together this presentation. So the question at hand is, are community values overrated? And I asked myself this question because I think anytime I get a chance to speak with younger crowds and generations, I find that there is this constant a constant questioning of the values that the older generations have, right? So remember, any generation, every 25 years, we're dealing with a whole generation, right? And so I see this constant sort of questioning and sometimes outright rebellion, right, against values. And I think that sometimes the rebellious part comes from a lack of understanding and a linear conversation that's being had about whether it be femininity, masculinity, education, socioeconomic status, all these different factors that affect us as humans, right, having this experience, are all guided really by values and the values that are instilled within the communities that we have lived in. So some of what we're going to do today is really sort of define what community values and cultural realities are. We're going to also explore the interconnectivity of community values and cultural realities. And we're going to look to understand our role in communities and discuss how these may be redefined. Because again, if you are the questioning of why certain values exist, that's obviously going to at some point bring you to a place where you want to change those values. And if it is in fact that you decide that as a young adult that you want to change a set of values that were passed on to you either through your family or through your community, then you should understand that there is a process for that as well. There's a process for when we want to redefine values as a community. I don't find it to be very healthy when we rebel against something that we don't even understand, because sometimes the consequences of that are actually further detrimental than the cause that we think that we're following in the first place. So at any point in this conversation, I do invite you to drop your questions in the chat so that you don't forget them, or any thoughts or feedback. I don't want this to be a conversation, a one-way conversation. So I do want to pause in about 15 minutes to just really give you guys some time to ingest, react, and as much as possible, just really authentically share your experience as I'm sharing these thoughts. So one of the reasons why I love to start off with definition is because often enough, two people are having a conversation and each person has a different framework for the same word. And because those two people have different frameworks, you and I are saying potato, you're saying potato, but you're seeing like mashed potatoes and I'm seeing like wedges, you know what I'm saying? I'm seeing unhealthy food, you're seeing healthy food, etc. And so I love to start off conversations by defining. I do this in the workplace of a lot of professionals because this is something that will never get old. Let's define what it is that we're talking about. So that way there is no confusion, because I have a partner, a romantic partner, for example, and sometimes I kind of hear the conversation going awry and I'm like, babe, I don't think you understand what I'm saying. Let's take it back a notch. Let's actually start to define, what do you mean by this? And what do you mean by that? Let me tell you what I mean by this. And it's a great practice that I feel like has really helped my communication as an adult, my communication as a partner, as a community member, as an educator, as a professional, because it does. Because the point of having a conversation is what? To really understand what the person's trying to say. This is not a debate, okay? This is not we don't have to be like battling each other to have a conversation. If anything, a conversation should be one of growth. Anytime I leave a space where I'm conversing with someone, I want to say, oh, I learned something new, or I feel edified by this conversation. So let's start off with community. For some of these, I use dictionary definitions, and for others of these, I've used definitions that through the Institute Maruke Kundi, which is an educational institute that I work with, we've also sort of defined as well. So community is defined as a unified body of individuals, such as bodies of persons or nations having a common history or common social, economic, and political interest. Number two, it could also be a social state or condition. Number three, it could also just be talking about society at large. And throughout my conversation, I will be speaking to these three definitions. Values is defined as relative worth, utility, the importance of something such as a principle or quality of or state of being, an intrinsically valuable or desirable thing. And again, in the conversation I'll be using the various definitions. Cultural reality, something that the Institute has dubbed and uses a lot in our pedagogy, is the social relational paradigm specific to a collective of people from which a person draws the social constructs that define their mentality and behaviors towards themselves and others in their environment. And so with each of these definitions, I would like to propose an offering. And so with the definition that we find with community, I think it goes without saying that each and every single one of us are a part of a community, various communities at that, right? If we're talking about a unified body, like right now, we can decide that, hey, this call will now be a community, right? Where then we get to decide what that means as a collective. For values, it's important for us to understand that we adopt values from our various communities, which are essentially our influencers. And later on in the presentation, I'll define like what are these different communities that influence our values. And my offering for cultural reality is that though we may occupy the same space as other people, that doesn't mean we're living the same reality. And the university space is actually, for me, in my opinion, one of the most starkest examples of this definition, because in the university, you have folks that are coming from low socioeconomic statuses, wealthy families. You're talking about people who are coming from the working class. You're talking about people who are coming from, internationally, locally, right? From across the country. You're talking about people who speak different languages, et cetera, right? And so that means me being at Fairleigh Dickinson, that doesn't mean that the students that are in the space with me are sharing the same reality and experience, simply because we do not share the same cultural reality. Okay. So community. So community, again, begins with family. We're all born essentially into a community. And so by default, right, we have this space and this collective of people, whether it's just your parents or like me, whether it's the aunts, the uncles. I truly am a child that is raised by a village. And I love Sobon Fusome. She writes a book. It's called The Art of Intimacy. And in her book, she talks about being able to wake up every day and decide who will be her mother. Because she can go stroll off to one of her aunties and say, I'm going to be around this woman. I'm going to shadow her. I'm going to do things with her today. And today she's my mother. And in a community setting, especially like the ones that I grew up in, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. If I don't come home and my mom knows I'm with my aunt, there's no issue there. And so I was lucky to be born in a very expansive community. Geolocation also defines our community. Social economic status defines our community. Institutions define our community. Interests and virtual spaces, obviously now with the advent of technology. When it comes to values, values are really drawn primarily from our humanity, from the simple fact that we are a separate species than a plant, a separate species than the animals that roam in the savannah or in the jungle or et cetera. Our humanity really does speak a lot to the fundamental and some of the universal natural laws that exist on Earth. And so these values inform us, and we also inform them, right? Because at the end of the day, as stewards of this planet, we also get to define certain values that we want to impose on nature and of our natural environment. Consciousness is also something that informs our values, right? How much do you know? And when I say know, I don't mean, just the learned experience of knowing, but I mean intrinsically, right? When people talk about like that gut feeling or that external sense that some of us have, but consciousness, human consciousness, right? That which the humanity has been able to contribute since we've occupied this planet is a universal consciousness, whether you're Asian, whether you're Al-Kebulan or African, or whether you're European. We all have this sort of consciousness that lives in the ethers that does inform our values of things. Resources. The kind of resources you have access to actually defines your values. I'll give you a prime example. So IT is the island of Hispaniola, and in IT you have the 10 departments, okay, and it's essentially just divided into the different strata. I'm from the north. I'm from Atibonit, and in my department, our resources are rice. We have a lot of rice plains, okay? Rice and legumes, okay? So primarily, the resource that we value are rice crops, animal husbandry, such as grazing cows and sheep and goat, things of that nature. In the South, they have, their staple crop is corn. And their region is a lot more mountainous, and they do not have a lot of valleys. And so a lot of the foods that they eat are what we call vive, which is called roots vegetables here in the States. And so you recognize, like, even diet-wise, that there's a different sense of value set in what we eat and in the crops that are valuable to us. So corn, and where I'm from, is not really seen as anything. Like we don't really pay attention to it. I know how to cook a few dishes here with corn, but you give me corn, I may not value it as much. Whereas in the South, they seriously value corn. I mean, my sister-in-law, who's from the South, makes like dessert out of corn, which I didn't even know was possible before her. Obviously cornbread. She makes bread out of corn. She makes like stews out of corn. I mean, she makes everything using corn. And so clearly this is someone who values this particular staple crop, because it is a resource that has been available to her and her ancestors for a long period of time. They even have a corn festival, y'all. Okay, they have a corn festival. They venerate corn fields, as in, like, there are areas even in on the continent where I'm staying here. I'm currently in Benin, where they actually have yam festivals, and I mean, they make offerings to like a particular divinity, because yam here is an important crop. So talk about value set when it comes to a resource that has been sort of given geographically to a people, and how they've decided to venerate that crop, because this crop has been a staple aspect or a fundamental aspect of that group of people's food source and nutritional source, right? So value sets are also presented when we're talking about evolution, right? Let's just say we are a society that has now been plagued with a particular disease or a particular circumstance. It could be a natural phenomenon. It could have been, something that occurred, right? That just sort of flipped our whole concept of things up. And now we need to redefine our values in order to adapt, in order to evolve with the times, right? Because we know that Earth is constantly evolving. I can only imagine slowly drifting, apart as we understand. And now there's like ocean being built in between them. And so I believe that those people had to start figuring out what different value sets could allow them to evolve. And so that they can continue to adapt to Earth's ever-growing changes. And then lastly, I would put cosmology, right? Cosmology, because I don't think that there's a single human on this planet that doesn't understand that, this planet is only one of many different planets that exist within our universal system, right? And so each of the collective groups of human beings have developed value sets based off of their relationship also with cosmology, right? And so we'll later talk about how those sort of transmit into more concrete concepts. And that's when we're confronted with cultural reality. And so when we're talking about cultural reality, we're talking about the lived day-to-day experience of human beings, right? And so that's where we get culture from, music, traditions, clothing, etc., right? The exciting part of being a human, right, in my opinion. Customs, right? How we build our customs. Why is it that we must respect our elders, et cetera, et cetera. Education, as I mentioned earlier, learning is a default setting for the human being. Just like any other creature on this planet, we learn, right? And that's a default thing. You can't stop yourself from learning even if you wanted to, right? But education is the kind of learning. What are we learning? Are we learning to fish because we're ocean people, or seaside people? Are we learning to plant yams because we live on the mountains? Are we learning, this, that, and a third? All of that is really defined by certain values that we create and that we create as a community and the community itself, because our education needs to be able to do what? Teach us how to solve our own problems. Teach us to live within the paradigm that we've been born in, right? And so we also have governance. So the way that that human beings are governed, the way that the dynamics and the community and the society will choose to govern itself is part of your cultural reality. And then last I have on here is the spirituality. Spirituality, again, goes back to that relationship with the cosmos. It is a set of value sets that are very specific to the relationship of human beings with one another, and again, with human beings with the larger cosmos, the larger space that we occupy. And so, with all of these things I just said, what is the anchor? What does this all mean? Why does it matter? So at the bottom here, I have these anchors. And the anchor for me for community is that community is an integral part of the human experience, simply because you're actually born into them automatically. Could you imagine the human experience if your mother just had you in the woods and just like left you there, right? But no, even through your birthing process, your mother's there, her family may be there. You have a midwife or a doctor that's there. You have attendants, you may have a doula that's there. So even the birthing process teaches you already that you're not alone. You're not to walk and journey this earth, this experience by yourself. And through that initiation that we call birth, we're taught that, right? Your mother's, pushing you out, or a C-section is happening, and you're literally being put in the hands of other human beings. So that already tells us that community is integral. And it is something that we must foster, we must contribute to positively, because it actually influences our state of health. Anytime I hear about, suicide happening at our school, I remember being at UM and learning about suicide incidents from the freshman towers. And it literally just shook me up, because I didn't understand how a person could feel like they were so alone that they felt like they just had to make an early exit. I couldn't fathom it. I understand that life is rough. I understand that we have challenges, but I also understand that, we have friends that we can run to. We have family that we can run to. And if you don't have family, you have chosen family, right? I call my friends my chosen family, people that I get to decide to be in community with because of the values that they hold, and the principles by which they live. And there's a beautiful Bantu principle that says, Umuntu, Ugumuntu, Agabantu, which means a person is a person because of people. So they teach us that our personhood is actually defined by the community. So moving on to our values, for me, the anchor here is that values are developed. A lot of the values that you and I have, whether it be whether it be the value that every human being deserves respect, regard, and that you are actually responsible for your brethren. That was something that was passed on to me. I didn't create that. So values are developed by leadership. Now, leadership can be represented by different things. It could be the elders, it can be the sages, it can be the ancients, it can be the current administration, right? It could be the administrators at your school. It could be the educator and the professors of your courses that create value sets within their classrooms, right? One thing that I value a lot, and one thing that I always share with my students, is that in this space, we must respect human life. We must have regard for others. And we must have a sense of responsibility for one another. So the 3 R's is a value set that I developed because I was a leader of that space. But a lot of the values that we have are adopted, right? And so as a growing adult, it's important for you to stop and ask yourselves, when did we stop valuing women in certain spaces? The question shouldn't be, oh, well, women, well, women aren't valued here, and how does that make us feel? It should be, when did we stop valuing the person that actually creates every human, the person's responsible for every person's in this world? We need to start asking ourselves those questions. Ask and, stop yourself sometimes and ask, where did I get this value set from? When did I think that it was okay to actually treat another human being as a subhuman, as anything less? In our institute, we have a saying that says, there's no such thing as being superhuman. There's only something as being less than human. As in, you can treat someone as less than human, but to treat someone as sometimes, like when you're doing a nice gesture and people are like, oh, well, you're so kind. And I always say, no, I'm being human. This is what humans do. You're struggling. I see you struggling, and I'm stopping to help you because you're a human, I'm a human, and that's what we do for each other, right? It would be subhuman. It would be less than human for me to see you struggling and then for me to just brush off and pass by as if I didn't see what I just saw. And so that was a lesson that I learned in college, that this whole idea that the superhumans are the ones flying on capes and doing acrobatics and doing things that humans really don't possess the power to do, is for me a deflection of the fact that we behave as subhumans oftentimes, and therefore we need the concept of the superhuman to teach us again about our humanity. And that's a shame. I find that it's a shame that we need superhuman beings to teach us that actually to be human is what elevates that vibration. And to be anything less is unfortunate, or to treat anyone as less is unfortunate. So that anchor is really, it's really something for you to really think about, in the value sets that you're adopting. And for cultural reality, we recognize cultural realities existing as Al-Kebulan and or African, because Al-Kebulan was actually the original name that was understood on the continent before it was renamed by Leo Africanus, Asians, and Europeans. And why is it important to understand that culture defines our reality? Because it does. There's a way that I speak to adults that are minimum 15 years older than me because of my culture. I do particular things when a child comes into this world because of my culture. And so our culture does define our realities. And there's only 3 cultural realities on this planet because we have all evolved within that structure, be it which is mainly geographical. And because of the length, just the sheer amount of time that these cultures have taken to cultivate themselves, we call these cultural realities because they are the realities that are the longest standing and that have existed the longest. And I also put them in the in the order of oldest to youngest. I leave you with questions. I think in every conversation, it's important to leave with questions. And my question for you today is, whose narrative are you living by? Whose narrative are you living by? We talked about community, we talked about values, we talked about cultural realities. All of that begins to tell a story. Your community, the values that you guys carry, and then the culture, the lived realities of these cultures begin to form these narratives. I had narratives that were being created for me as a Haitian person living in the States. But I chose to live by the narrative that my parents were telling me, which was that I belonged. I belonged in these spaces. I was human and that I deserved to be treated with human dignity. And so I'm very fortunate that the narrative of my home space overshadowed the narrative that was being created for me. And so you must ask yourself every day, what narrative am I living by? Am I living by the one that I created for myself? Because as an adult, now I get to choose. I get to choose to maybe mix a little bit of what I learned from home with what I learned from school, with what I learned when I went to that trip to the islands, or to that trip that I went here, or what this professor told me that was profound there. I get to create that story for myself, and I get to live by it authentically each and every single day. And that was my greatest gift to myself. And so with narratives, it's important for us to really look at, as students more so, it's important for you at the stage of your career and of your life to really hone in on relationship building, right? Because these are going to inform the narratives. If you are going into every single relationship and you're looking to foster authentic relationships and dynamics with the people that you share space with, you are going to grow immensely from those relationships, whether it be with your peers or with your professors, etc. And so those authentic relationships, and when I use the word authentic, I mean that which is true to you. Are you living out your life authentically? Are you being honest and open with yourself about who you are? Because until you're open and honest with yourself about who you are, you can never be open and honest with me. Okay. And so that is a key part of building those communities. And don't you forget that. Secondly, is to recognize influence and accountability, understanding that your individual actions really do define the collective experience and really does define what we become as a society. You and I get to determine what society becomes tomorrow based off of what we're doing right now. And so we must be very liable, and there must be a lot of accountability, and you must be open to the constructive criticism that's going to come out with that. And the last thing that I'd like to impart is to understand leadership and authorship. In my opinion, I think this is one of the most important things, and it really does build up, because once you start to know yourself and to understand your influence in your community, you really start building those leadership skills. Because developing yourself is a part of being a leader. I'm constantly looking at how I can better myself in this space. And when you start doing that, you realize that you actually start to set the standards for the people around you. Like, people know when they come to my house not to wear shoes. I start to set that standard because I recognize, why I don't want to wear shoes in my home, right? Leadership requires that you also speak truth, right? That you call a spade, that you call it just it is. That you recognize that not everything that's fine for you is actually real. That not every construct or every concept that has been defined for you is actually truth. Right? Very similar to those, those things that I mentioned that were being said about Haitians. There was no truth to any of that. That was, a lot of that was made up, right? Or taken out of context. And it's also important for you to remember that whatever it is that you want to ask for someone else to do, whether it be your administrator or your school administration or your country president, that you must be ready to ask that for yourself. Ask that of yourself, because that's what real leaders do. You don't ask someone to do something that you're not willing to do. And with that, when we talk about sustainability, we're talking about behaviors and mentality that is so deeply ingrained in us that it's automatic, that it's a default setting. And that's what you're here to build as you're growing into your adulthood, right? Is you're learning to create those default settings for yourself. And with that, I'd like to pause to sort of get some of your reactions, if we have enough time, that is, and to see if you guys also have any questions.
All right, any questions? You can use the chat. You can raise your hand and then we can have you unmute because I'm big on showing face and hearing your own voice. But while we're waiting for that, I do have my own questions because I was listening to it and I heard you when we first met. We were talking about you asked the question, when did we start as a society not seeing women as equal? And personally, I've been raised and been surrounded by strong, independent Black women. So I've grown up looking up to authority and looking up to strength. And I've never understood this kind of mindset of women not being equal because I grew up in my culture and my environment, my community. My family's always respected our women. So I personally, I don't have an answer for that question of when did we start? Because I never started personally, but as a society, I was wondering if you knew the answer, or if there even is an answer to when did we start that?
That's a great question. And as university students, the greatest gift that you have at this time is the gift of being able to research and ask this question of many other people, because my answer may not, my answer is also going to be limited to what I know and have experienced. But I will say this. So for me, I come from a cultural reality that sees women as complementary, right? When we talk about equity, for example, versus equality, because we know that we're all humans, but we do have our differences, right? Whether that be biological or hormonal, etc. And so I come from a society that recognizes those differences, right? We don't sort of like sweep them under the rug. We're like, no, she has a womb and she can reproduce certain things that this other person can't. And so we're not going to treat her necessarily the same, but we're going to treat her with dignity, right? So for example, in Al-Kebalan societies, the Akan, for example, there's matrilineal, matriarchal societies. There are societies that are actually governed by the maternal lineages of people. And then also in our governance, they have, for example, they have this sort of setup where back in the day, there would be a council of women elders and a council of male elders. And each of these councils had different sort of issues that they managed, because they recognized that certain issues that needed to be managed needed the woman's perspective because of her human experience. And so there's really, I can't actually give you a date for that, because the devaluing of women in the American society has been something that goes sort of back to it goes back to so many different dynamics, right? We're talking about dynamics of Europeans now coming onto this new territory, and they're coming with their sort of value sets, the same value set that they may have had with their women when they were still in France or still in Britain. And so they carry some of those things here. And so me as a Al-Kebalan woman, and I'm sure the native women probably feel the same, it's like we don't have the same concept of a woman's role in society. And so I think that would be a great question to say, a great question to explore further, because I think that how we see women in the American society is very much so dictated by the European set of values around women. It's not dictated by what my ancestors think about women, because my ancestors have shown me through the different structures that were integrated in society, such as governance structures, spiritual structures, that women are complementary to the masculine. The feminine is complementary to the masculine. For example, the word God in Benin, where I'm currently now, is Maulisa. Maulisa. And Mau is the representation of the feminine. Lisa is representation of the masculine. So the word for God is like girl, boy, or woman, man. That's literally how we define God. And it's not just in Benin. Ghana has the same, Nigeria has the same. I can name on and on how many societies on this continent that names God by using a dual concept or a duality concept. that includes both the feminine and the masculine, never one or the other. We don't pit the sexes against one another in the societies that I know. But it is true that in the American society as we know it today, definitely, you know, opposite sexes, right? Why do we say opposite sexes as opposed to complementary sexes? You know what I mean? So these are the things that I encourage you all to explore further. Look into the cultural realities and see how different cultures value women and what sort of structures have different cultures put into place that shows that demonstrates their value of their feminine and of their masculine complementary parts.
Thank you so much. And I'm not gonna ask all my questions because we be here all night talking about this topic. I could talk about it forever. So so I'm gonna allow for some students or faculty and staff, whoever's in the Zoom, please raise your hand and try to engage in this conversation as well. It's a good conversation. I'm enjoying it. And truthfully, I think we need to have this conversation. So wait, someone said something.
Yeah, he's looking for Melanie. I'm writing some of the names here, in case you guys want to just look those up.
Oh, you're writing the name. I was like, wait, are you calling on someone? So I was really well, while we're waiting for someone to ask a question, then I'm going to expand a little bit, maybe a university level for our students here, which is you talked about community and like education and being involved in sustainable development goals. How can we as students, I feel like we ask this a lot to our presenters, but I think it's a good question. How can we as students in university level get more involved, engaged, and maybe because people think of involvement as the big scale, like you have to be crazy involved. Like, no, you can start small. So how do you, what advice do you have for students in that regard?
So I would say the first thing is, you know, the first step of really being authentically yourself is to really look at your interests. What actually makes your heart beat? Like what is that one thing you could just be on the internet all night, like looking into, you know? It all starts there. It all starts with your heartstrings, like your interest, what you care about. You know, no one is here to tell you what you should care about. Or what you should value. You must define that for yourself. And in order for you to define that for yourself, you have to start being honest with yourself. It's like, am I really going to this volunteer thing because, you know, I just want to make my resume look good, or I just want to check off the box, or I want to make my parents proud, or I'm trying to make someone proud, or I'm trying to find a mate, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And some of those things are okay. It's okay if you want to join a club because you saw a friend there and he's handsome and you want him, you know, whatever. Right? You're going to have all those different experiences in college. You're going to have all those sort of, well, I want to do this because I do want to make my father proud. My father was in this club and I want to be the legacy of that. And that's something that's valuable to me. Great. So let those things that are interesting to you be the driving force of the issues that you look to better, the issues that you look to contribute to. Because I always say this, well, I don't say this, it's a proverb that says this, you know, one hair in the hand is better than two hairs in the bush, which means that whatever it is that you're able to actually grasp and connect to is better than whatever theoretical concept that lives out there in the bushes that never really materializes because you've never really taken the time to connect to it. So it's not about quantity, it's really about the quality of things that you want to do. And again, it starts with self. What issues do you want to affect?
All right. And I think that's a good point for us to end it. I want to say thank you so much. Can everyone please join me in giving a virtual or actual hand clap? Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us at Fairleigh Dickinson University. I really enjoyed our conversation and hopefully you can come back and teach us some more one day.
It will be my pleasure. Well, again, I want to thank you all. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Maricela. Thank you, Shytail. And thank you to you all who tuned in today. I trust that we were learning together and that, you know, I've given you some things to think about. Thank you all again and have a great rest of your afternoon or evening.
Thank you. All right.